There are a number of factors that influence the scalability of OSPF. The first factor is the number of prefixes. This is probably one of the biggest keys here as well. So the more prefixes that OSPF has to handle, obviously the scalability is going to be of concern. And this is again why in a routing protocol we like to do things like summarization. So the more summarization we could do, routers that cannot handle a lot of prefixes, they do a lot better when we reduce the number of prefixes by doing something like summarization. Well, that's not the only thing that influences OSPF's scalability. The stability of the connections is also another factor. When we think about stability of connections, we think about a link flapping up and down. So what happens in OSPF when a link flaps up and down? Well, it's pretty simple. As the link flaps up and down, OSPF has to keep recalculating the database because, well, the neighbor comes and goes, and all the routes from that neighbor come and go. And so that has a big influence on the scalability of OSPF and really the stability as well. Also, the number of adjacent neighbors for any one router is going to have some influence on the scalability of OSPF. So think in terms of having a router with 100 neighbors. Well, 100 neighbors are going to be flooding link state advertisements through the network. We're going to have to handle these link state advertisements as they get flooded through the network. So we're going to handle this times 100, right? And so as this happens, if we have 100 neighbors, if we have 200 neighbors, if we have 300 neighbors, the more neighbors we have, well, obviously our scalability with OSPF is going to be affected, right? The more neighbors we have, the more resources that we have to allocate to handling the neighbor, to taking care of managing the connection, managing the link state database information, checking those LSAs to make sure that we're not receiving old information, communicating with hellos with those neighbors. That's going to take some processing. So there's really quite a bit that's going on here when I talk about having a lot of neighbors. Now, another influencing factor to OSPF's scalability is the number of adjacent routers inside of an area. So one of the scalability mechanisms of OSPF is that of configuring an area. So when we design our OSPF, we really want to step back and look and say, okay, who is going to go in area 0? What are my connections going to be? What are my routers that are going to be adjacent? And we got to remember that with OSPF, we design with an area 0 in mind, that being the backbone. And then we have other areas that attach to that. Let's say this is area 1, and then let's say this is area 2. So we use this mechanism so that we minimize the impact of changes. So something that changes inside of area 1 isn't necessarily going to impact area 2. But as we increase the number of adjacent routers within this area, if that's the case, well, then we could be running into some issues. So we think about having, 10 routers adjacent inside this area. Well, now I've got to manage all of those adjacencies within the area. I've got my area border router. We got to think about how LSAs are going to be flooded, how they're going to be passed, and so on. So the more routers I have inside of an area, even though I'm localizing the impact of a topology change here, I'm still also within that area impacting the stability and the scalability of OSPF.